Welcome to Justice Counts, the podcast that goes beyond the law to what's important to you. Equal justice for all is a guidepost for our nation, but how do we achieve that? Here are your hosts, writer-commentator Bob Gaddy and novelist-attorney Mark M. Bello.
Hey, today we welcome Roger Canaff, an award-winning legal thriller author whose writing is influenced by his experiences as a child protection and anti-violence against women advocate, legal expert, and speaker. He's devoted his legal career to the eradication of violence against women and children, first as a prosecutor in Alexandria, Virginia, then as a special victims ADA in the Bronx. Roger also was president of the board of directors of End Violence Against Women International, an organization that provides training, technical assistance, research, and advocacy. He now teaches undergraduate and law school classes and trains and consults privately, both nationally and internationally. He's a charter member of CounterQuo, an organization of allied professionals challenging the way our culture responds to sexual violence. Most recently, he became a consultant with Justice3D.com, a leading educator in issues related to investigating and prosecuting sexual assault, child abuse, and domestic violence cases. He's the author of 4 novels and lives and works in New York City. Roger, thrilled to have you with us today on Justice Counts. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Wow, a special victims ADA in the Bronx. Did Law and Order pattern Raphael Barba, whatever his name is, after you?
I wish. It was a great experience.
I know that's Hollywood, but does the show do a good job of depicting what actual prosecutions like these are all about?
It does. They've got good consultants. There are a lot of people who are in the profession. There are a couple that I knew when I was in the Bronx, actually, that were consultants for Law and Order and for similar shows. Other than condensing. I mean, as you say, it's television. Yeah, sure. But they actually do a pretty decent job. I mean, I've seen a lot of really terrific, high value, well produced shows that nevertheless just have silly courtroom scenes. I mean, they just lose the rules for the sake of drama, and I don't think that's necessary. I think you can have a pretty compelling legal show without completely going off the rails in terms of the rules of cross-examination and things like that, which you have to do for dramatic purposes condensed. There's no question about that.
Are the cops more like Stabler or Benson?
The cops, I loved working with NYPD. I'm not sure if art imitates life or the other way around, but NYPD, they definitely act and walk and talk the way you just expect that they would. I mean, I was a prosecutor outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia for several years when I began my career. And that was a great police department too, Alexandria City. And they were wonderful men and women, just great people and good cops. But it definitely, when I got to New York, is when I really experienced, wow, this is American cultural, what people expect police to be, in some ways both good and bad, but happily mostly good. I mean, obviously, you run into bad cops anywhere, just like you run into bad plumbers, bad lawyers, bad everything. But for the most part, they were terrific, doing a very good job.
But I've always had a crush on Mariska. I'm just wondering if there are cops like her around.
I think so. Yeah, I met a few.
All right. We'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
So you and I have some things in common. We're both attorneys. Mm-hmm. We've both handled sexual abuse cases. We've both written books about these issues from different perspectives, obviously. After 3 years of only handling one such case, I was physically and mentally exhausted. You see this stuff every day when you're practicing. Is there a lot of burnout in your office? What do you do to unwind in your shoes? And do you take this stuff home with you?
Yeah, there is a lot of burnout. Vicarious trauma is an important issue, and that's actually the training that I'm doing most recently. There's a nonprofit group that I'm involved with. It's called Innocent Justice. Innocent Justice is a training company based out of California, and they're grant funded. And what they do is they provide support for law enforcement, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, pretty much anyone who has to consume, particularly child exploitation or child sexual exploitation materials. Excuse me. And they do a terrific job at that. And it's everything from breathing exercises to taking a break every few minutes to focusing on something across the room to physically moving your body. When you're going over a case file. There are real concrete strategies, some stuff that, it's not particularly deep or psychological, just some concrete strategies that can help you to just sort of maintain your sense of self while you're actually doing these cases.
I'll bet you, though, when you bring one of these people to justice, you must have a real sense of satisfaction.
It is. It's a wonderful feeling. I mean, lives are torn apart by crime. They're not put back together by criminal litigation. I mean, there's only so much you can do when you're just looking at a trail of human records that somebody's caused, even when the law catches up with them and they're going to be punished for it. There's really only so much repair that can be done, I guess. But absolutely, the feeling of satisfaction that comes with it it's incalculable.
What prompted you to focus your work on violence against women and children?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something I have always wanted to do. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse myself. It's a part of my public background. It's well known about me. It's something I've shared publicly in the last 10 or 15 years. And I think I might have explained this actually to Bob earlier, but I don't think that is really what drove me into the field. Army of psychologists might disagree with me, but I don't know. It's something that once I became interested in the law, I said to myself, if I'm going to be a lawyer, which by that point in undergrad, it looked like that's where I was heading. I just said to myself, I really think I want to do this. I think I'll be good with women and children. I think I am. I think I do have a good temperament for it. I think I have the right manner. I think I wanted to do it for the right reasons. I was always able to maintain a professional attitude. I don't think I took things too personally. So I think it was just a good match.
Is that how it was? Are you able to pick your own path in the prosecutor's office, or do they pick it for you?
Well, I was lucky. There weren't. I was lucky in terms of timing, I guess. There weren't a lot of men that wanted to do special victims work when I got into prosecution in the mid to the late 90s. Just to be blunt, it was considered women's work for a long, long time. If you had a typical prosecutor's office in the U.S., the average U.S. prosecutor's office is very small. It's like under 15 or 10 assistants, and of course, you got the legendary big city offices: Detroit, Chicago, New York, L.A. But even in the bigger offices, the idea for the longest time was, well, if there's a child abuse case, find a woman in the office and give it to her because she's a woman, she'll be maternal. And there's a lot of truth to that. Of course, it's not universally true, but for whatever the reason was, there weren't many men that wanted to get into special victims work. And I really did. And I expressed to my boss why. And he was like, okay. He's like, it's not a very popular area of the law. It's a difficult area to prosecute for all the reasons that we've discussed. But I was enthusiastic about it, and he brought me into it. And it was because of that I got into the training circuit pretty early, because there were mostly women, but women and men around the country that were beginning serious training initiatives again, around the time that I started. And so by the early 2000s, I had 4 or 5 years under my belt, and I began to train others on investigation and prosecution of the same issues.
It's interesting. You're a trailblazer in the Men Too movement, I guess. Mm-hmm. I know we're here to talk about your books, but I've written 2 books. 2 of my 8 books are about different aspects of sexual assault. Mm-hmm. Betrayal of Faith, as we discussed off air, is about the clergy abuse scandal. Mm-hmm. And Supreme Betrayal was inspired by the Kavanaugh hearings and the Me Too movement. I presume you've handled both types of sexual assault in your career. How are these cases alike, and also how are they different?
Well, clergy abuse is something, it's interesting. Clergy abuse is actually something I didn't see a lot of. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I think in Alexandria City in Virginia, I was in the Diocese of Arlington, and I grew up Catholic, and I remain Catholic. They may kick me out at some point, but until they do, I'm sort of in the club. But the Diocese of Arlington was actually fairly clean, at least in terms of reports. We weren't seeing a lot of reports from that diocese or in Alexandria City when I was there. Doesn't mean it wasn't happening, but we weren't seeing a lot of reports of it. I did see more of them, a couple more in the Bronx, and then of course I consulted on a ton of them once I got onto the training circuit and once I was doing individual consulting. So I've seen quite a few of them now. How they are similar to, and I'm sorry, what was the other point of comparison? The Kavanaugh case, or
yes, a Me Too type case.
Oh, I got you. Yeah.
Where an adult accuses another adult of sexual assault.
Right. Well, the dynamics of child sexual abuse are such that the vast majority of child sex abusers groom, right? So they prepare the child for the sexual abuse, and grooming is basically, it's a slow draw of the child into sexual activity, which I'm sure you explain in Betrayal of Faith. I can't wait to get into it. Priests are no different, abusive priests, I should say, are no different than any other child sexual predator in that, what does every predator need in terms of child sexual abuse? They generally need three things. They need a steady stream of trusting victims. They need a cover for what it is that they're doing, and they need an institution, ideally, that will protect them, move them around, and conceal them. And unfortunately, as we've seen over the centuries, the Catholic Church has provided all three. And before I start sounding anti-Catholic, every single religion in the world struggles with this. Every single one. Mormonism, Protestantism, Judaism, Islam. Every religion provides these things, unfortunately, to predatory people. So religious institutions, usually without their knowledge, become magnets, unfortunately, for predatory people. It's just one of those things. If the Catholic Church over the centuries was a place where you could, if you got into the religious life, you had access to children. They were trained to obey you. They were brought up with various sacraments and religious processes that they were involved as an adult in, with children in their care and under their power. There was a natural cover for adults, particularly adults who had no sexual interest in other adults, right? Because priests and nuns, at least for the last 1,000 or so years, haven't been able to marry according to the church. So there was a cover if you had no sexual interest in adults. You weren't expected to marry. In fact, you weren't allowed. And then finally, and most tragically, the Catholic Church, unfortunately, over the centuries, rather than dealing with this head on and working with civil authorities and other things, instead kept it in-house, hushed it up, and went to some extreme lengths. And again, I know that, Mark, that this as well, probably better than I do, that was sort of the outcome. When it comes to adult on adult sexual abuse, the dynamics are generally a little bit different. It's still about power and control. It's, and there can still be grooming. There can still be grooming situations can occur in adult on adult sexual abuse situations. The typical, the classic sort of image that many people have of rape, and I put it in air quotes only because it's one particular definition and view of it, but it's the sort of violent, out of nowhere attack that does happen, and it's nightmarish. But a far more common sexual abuse or assault scenario involves one adult basically prepping his or her victim and grooming them, drawing them into their life, drawing them into letting their guard down. In the Kavanaugh situation, I think exactly what she said is what occurred. I think he scared the hell out of her in a sexual manner, and that's what she recalls, and that's what she remembers. I think that the two of them, Blasey Ford and Kavanaugh, I think they were both raised in an environment where, it was predominantly wealthy or upper middle class kids. There was probably something of a lack of adult supervision, which is not uncommon then and now. There were parties, kids were messing around, they were doing things, they were courting, they were hooking up. They were doing whatever they were doing, and I think Kavanaugh
drinking,
absolutely. I think that would absolutely fueled it, and I think Kavanaugh found himself in a situation where he was like, yeah, this is kind of a typical Friday night. And I think he did exactly what she said. I think he jumped on her. I think he wrestled with her. I think one of the things that's key about that particular case is what Blasey Ford didn't allege. For all of the deniers out there, oh, she's lying. She's absolutely lying. If she were lying, why not make up a better or a more complete story? She never said that Kavanaugh raped her. She never said that Kavanaugh digitally penetrated her. She said exactly what occurred. And she also acknowledges that she's a fragile person. She happens to be somebody that, that certainly at that time in her life was sort of emotionally fragile, easy to frighten, and I think it's what he did. I think he scared the hell out of her. So, did that involve grooming? Not necessarily. I mean, I think Kavanaugh probably knew her. I think they probably ran in the same circles. And again, as you say, I think there was alcohol provided. There was a lot of drinking going on. So I think some of those dynamics are similar, and they probably underpin. And in addition to Blasey Ford, there were several other people. I mean, their accounts varied, and I think the veracity of them or the likelihood of them and the facts differed. But I think Kavanaugh was somebody in his younger life that engaged in some reckless behavior. Whether or not that should disqualify him from the Supreme Court is a larger argument, but I don't have any problem believing it. Put it that way. I'm sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
Yeah. Roger. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the he said, she said type of cases. What tips the scales on those? Having multiple people saying essentially the same thing as happened in this case? Is that what does it, or what?
That's a big part of it, yeah. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and absolutely, if you're speaking to somebody and they're telling you, look, this happened to me, and by the way, the great majority of sexual assaults don't leave behind any compelling physical evidence or DNA or things of that nature for a lot of reasons. So oftentimes it is the victim's word and the offender's word. And if you're a prosecutor or some other adjudicator, in the case of Kavanaugh, it was the United States Senate, right? We are trying to determine whether or not there's enough basis to believe that this occurred. And Mark and I's prior life, we were either prosecutors or defense attorneys or civil attorneys trying to make these determinations in courts of law. But definitely, if you have previous and you have other particularly similar accounts of similar behavior, at least from my perspective, for the prosecutor, that frames it in such a way that, yeah, okay, this is somebody that I have an easier time believing, because clearly this is a pattern of behavior, and that too is very common. Most people who predate don't do this once and then say, oh wow, I did a dumb thing, I'll never do that again. For most people who predate sexually, they tend to do it over and over and over again in a similar way, over the course of their offending lives. Doesn't mean you can use that though. Yeah. That using evidence of previous complaints and things like that, the American courts have gotten a little bit more. They've gotten a little bit more prosecutor friendly in that some of that stuff can be used. We just saw it used in Harvey Weinstein. We saw it used in Bill Cosby. So some of the big cases have used that sort of previous complaint kind of a thing, but it's very, very dangerous. You've got to be very careful with it, both in fairness to the defendant and just in fairness to the truth. Just because somebody did something once doesn't mean they did it again. And when you're bringing up that kind of evidence in a court of law, it can be very scary if it's not used right.
You make an interesting life experience point there, though. When you look at him, and here's this arrogant, East Coast kid who's probably lived life on a silver platter, and he meets this shy girl, and he's drunk, and maybe she's drunk too, and it's no big deal to him to jump on a girl at a party, and to her it's a life-changing experience. It's an interesting, different life experience situation for the two of them.
Absolutely, and
she might have been one of 100 girls he did this to. For all we know.
What I have said before is, I grew up in the D.C. area. I grew up on the other side in the Virginia suburbs. My father was DEA all of his professional life. We were very, very standard middle class. It was not an environment very similar to the one that Kavanaugh grew up in Chevy Chase or Bethesda. But the point is, I have a close personal friend, a woman I grew up with, who grew up in exactly that environment. Relatively wealthy and right about the same age, maybe a couple of years younger. And I remember when she and I, I've known her for 25 years. She's just a lovely person. She and I were discussing this case in 2018 around the time that it happened. And I was on Anderson Cooper talking about it. And I remember she and I discussed it. And she said, she's like, what he did, that was a typical Friday night. That's what happened in parties in big houses in Chevy Chase and in those towns outside of DC in those days. It's just what happened. And I think one of the explanations for why Kavanaugh was seemed so taken aback and why he appeared to be so shocked, I don't think he remembers it. And when I talk to friends, particularly conservatives, but not exclusively, but when I talk to friends who truly believe that Blasey Ford made it up or that she was delusional or something, one of my responses to them is, look, I don't think Kavanaugh remembers this. Again, she did not assert that Kavanaugh full on raped her. She did not assert that he dragged her down an alley, that he did, what he did, I think, was pretty horrifying to her. What he did was absolutely inappropriate. It was wrong. But it certainly wasn't so profound. And I'm not even claiming that Kavanaugh would be capable of such a thing. I would never do that. But I am absolutely convinced that he's capable of what he did. I'm convinced that he did it. And I also believe that it probably was something that was relatively minor to him. He wrestled a girl, tried to get her bathing suit off or whatever. She said no. He said, doggone. And he and the guys went downstairs and continued on with their evening. I just don't think that's crazy. Happens all the time.
Politics aside, is it a childhood indiscretion or is it a disqualifying event for a potential Supreme Court justice?
I think mostly the latter. I would say that if he did remember it, if he did recognize it, I do think it's the kind of thing that a decent person would say, you know what? I was young. That was high school, but what I did obviously derailed someone's life. What I did had a terrible, terrible effect on another human being, and I should not sit. I mean, no one is entitled to a seat on the United States Supreme Court. The guy was a very successful, very very admired appellate judge. God knows he was a political operative before that. He had moved up through the ranks of the modern Republican Party. He was doing fine. So I do tend to think it's a qualifying event. Quick caveat: I would say though, if he had acknowledged it and apologized, who knows? All human beings make mistakes. We're all fallible. I don't think that fallibility has to include a sexual attack, which frankly this was. Again, not trying to make more of it than it was. Neither was she. But I think had he acknowledged it and apologized for it, even if he said, look, I don't quite remember this, but I'm sorry, I don't have a problem believing it happened. And I think it's pretty clear that it happened based on what she's saying. I would view him in a much, much better light than I do. Instead, I mean, what he chose to do was fiercely deny it. And then which kind of exposed additional temperament on his part that I think just that makes him a wrong choice for the Supreme Court just for, just on other issues. And
yeah, it was quite odd.
It was odd. And I'll tell you, blood sport was at the heart of this. Okay. So, and I think that's one thing that we have to acknowledge, either if we want to call ourselves Democrats or progressives or whatever, one of my favorite expressions is two things can be true at the same time. I think it is absolutely true that Kavanaugh committed a sexual attack against Blasey Ford. Relatively minor in the scope of how those things go, but I believe that's a truth. I also think it's true that there were elements of the Democratic leadership in the Senate that were very eager to attempt to use that against him in order to block his ascendance to the Supreme Court. So I think there was some cynicism on both sides there, and I don't think it's I don't think it's fair to say that Democratic Senate leadership came to this with completely clean hands and had no other interest than in just allowing her a voice. I think there was an effort, and Kavanaugh knows about that effort. Because Kavanaugh, if you remember, Kavanaugh was one of the architects of the Bill Clinton impeachment. Kavanaugh was a young, very bright, very aggressive lawyer who was right there playing blood sport when the Republican Party was looking to take Bill Clinton down in the late 90s. So you can say
what goes around comes around.
Taste your own medicine, whatever. But Kavanaugh is familiar with blood sport. Anybody who spends their life in Washington playing at that level and playing in those leagues understood blood sport, and that's what he was subjected to.
Yeah. And I think we should talk about your book a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I love talking about the law, justice, and
I love talking about either one.
My books, but we're here to talk about yours. So your latest book, as I understand it, is City Dark, which is going to be released this October. Exciting stuff for you.
October 1. I
know how it feels. How did you transition from practicing law to writing legal thrillers?
Well, I've been writing since I was a teenager. It was just the first novel that I wrote is called Copperhead Road. It's a coming of age story. I love it. If I say so myself, I'm very proud of it. I think it's a terrific book. Didn't get a lot of traction. I went through a small publishing house here in New York, Brooklyn Writers Press, who I love. They're great people. But in terms of sales, it didn't do all that well. It didn't launch me off of any platform. But I love the book, and it was very true to my life, and it's semi-autobiographical. So I've been writing since I was a teenager. But what happened was, as I became a prosecutor and I got into special victims, that experience, and I think Mark, it's the same for you. That experience just shaped my writing tremendously, and then got me into more specific legal thrillers, and that's what City Dark is.
Well, let's talk a little bit about it. Tell us what it's all about, kind of a summary of the plot and where it comes from. Did it come from your experience in any way?
Sure. Some of it is my experience.
Are we talking about City Dark or a different?
Yeah, quite a few.
City Dark.
Yeah. City Dark, exactly. So, I'll tell you what. The title City Dark comes from. It was sort of the last of a series of emergency communiques that went back and forth within the Consolidated Edison, the Con Ed, basically the New York power grid, and the principal energy provider to New York City and Westchester is Consolidated Edison, which everybody knows as Con Ed here. And on the night of the blackout in 1977, real quick, there were just a series of cataclysmic storms that occurred over Westchester. Most people know the basic facts. One thing led to another. Power lines were overloaded. There were efforts were made by Con Ed employees to try and mitigate it. So a series of communiques went back and forth, basically saying this power station's down, this power plant's been struck by lightning, this is happening, that's happening. And at the end of it, when they simply couldn't mitigate it anymore, there was a final communique at 9:37 p.m. which said Consolidated Edison power down, City Dark. So that's where the title comes from. And the 1977 blackout in New York City is the backdrop for the story. It's kind of the literary device. So the book begins with two boys, one's 10, one's 15. The principal protagonist is not really based on me. He's actually a very different character, but although there are some similarities, but we're the same age. He was born in 1967, so was I. He's 10 at the time of the blackout. His mother is driving both boys through New York City on the night of July 13th, 1977, and they run out of gas on what was then called the West Side Highway. There really isn't a West Side Highway now. It's the Henry Hudson Parkway. But in any event, they run out of gas on the west side of Manhattan, and she disappears. She leaves the boys in the car. She says she's going for gasoline. She never comes back. So the two boys have to make their way through the city on the night of the blackout. And I meticulously researched this, down to the street signs, what was on top of the cabs, the Abe Beam for mayor signs, because Abe Beam, of course, is the mayor in 1977, et cetera, et cetera. So the book goes back and forth between that night, what happened on the night of the blackout, and the present day. When the book opens in the present day, Joe's mother the woman who, Joe DeSantos is the principal protagonist, his mother, the one who disappeared on the night of the blackout, is found murdered on a Coney Island beach, which is about a mile or so from where Joe lives. He lives in an area called Bath Beach in Brooklyn, which is basically walking distance to Coney. So police track him down and they say, "Yeah, Mr. DeSantos, we found a woman on the beach. We have reason to believe it's her mother because of some memorabilia and some documents she had on her." He says, "Well, I haven't seen my mother in 40 years since the night of the blackout," and that's where the story takes off. So why is she?
That's where the story takes off. It hasn't already taken off.
Well, it takes, that's when it really gets going, basically, because the other aspect.
I'm sitting here on pins and needles. You said it hasn't taken off yet.
Without giving anything away or too much away, Joe also has
no more giveaways.
Yeah, no. Joe also has a lover, basically, an ex-girlfriend who also very, very quickly turns up dead in a similar manner. So Joe finds himself the suspect of two very, very brutal murders, and the hook, the really interesting thing, and again, not going to give anything away here, but this is all in the book description. Joe is a functional alcoholic, and he has experienced.
Bob, this is all in the first 15 pages.
Well, yeah, I was going to point out that the guy was a heavy drinker and couldn't remember a bunch of things that happened and wondered whether he could have done it or not. Right?
Yeah, that's another important driver for the story. Is Joe guilty? Is he not guilty? Because he absolutely has no memory of these things. And this is another thing that we learn.
I like this.
It's another thing you learn a lot about in sexual assault prosecution, sexual abuse prosecution, is the nature of blacking out and blackouts. It's a blackout is an actual neurological process where your mind, the ability to make memories in the hippocampus actually shuts off. It's as if it's an antiquated way to look at it, but it's as if the mind's VCR just stopped. It can no longer record. So Joe is mostly functional. He can, he gets to court and he does what he's supposed to do from day to day, but he loses whole days and whole blocks of time. So over the course of the book, he's trying to discover what happened on the nights where his mother and his ex-lover were murdered. He's trying to wrestle, could I have done this? Is it possible that I had this anger inside of me? And the book is then, interspersed with these flashbacks from the night of the blackout, which lends some insight to some of the trauma that drove all of this. So hopefully by the end of the book, you get your answers, but that's what it's about.
Yeah.
It sounds more like a crime thriller whodunit than it does a legal thriller. Where does a lawyer show up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
do things.
Joe is a lawyer. Joe is.
Oh, Joe's.
Yeah,
okay.
No, it's a great question. Joe is a lawyer. He's a former prosecutor, much like me. He also has done sex offender civil commitment work. So he's actually when the book opens, which is something I did. When the book opens, he's working for the Attorney General's office in the state of New York, and he's actually doing civil cases, sex offender civil commitment cases. And it's an old colleague of his, Adine Bradigan is her name. That's the character's name. She's based on a woman I know and a lawyer I work with and love dearly. And she is Joe's last hope. She is a dogged former prosecutor. She's kind of on her own. Her husband is a retired cop who's recently died from a 9/11 related cancer. So she's on her own raising kids. Basically, she just needs something to do and comes to Joe's aid. It's a long story as to how they're put together, but she defends him through the course of the book, and she is part of helping him uncover his trauma and to uncover the truth of what happened both the night of the blackout in 1977 and on the nights of these murders that occurred in Brooklyn in 2017, 40 years later, almost to the day.
Very interesting. I want my copy.
Absolutely. I will get you one.
All right. I've written 8 legal thrillers. Mm-hmm. They all feature Zachary Blake. He's become quite a legal hero, as Bob says every week. At least 2 of your novels, feature an attorney by the name of Alex Greco.
Correct.
Who's this guy? What's he about? Tell us about that series, and why didn't you continue using Alex as opposed to starting the fresh with Joe?
Well, I was looking around. I mean, the blunt answer is I started the Alex Greco series. Alex Greco is a character a little bit more similar to me than the protagonist in City Dark, but again, a very, very different character. A prosecutor, a white guy approaching middle age, so not entirely different from me, but a guy with a very, very different background. I love that legal series. I absolutely plan to continue it. The first in that series is called Among the Dead. It's a child abuse case. It involves a brutal murder of a child, and Alex is at the center of it as the prosecutor. The second one is a sex assault case involving I kind of like to do what you do, Mark. I know, I can tell already. You pull your stories from the headlines and you pull them from current events. The second in the Alex Greco series is called Bleed Through, and it involves a sexual assault by a very powerful venture capitalist against a young woman who's an entrepreneur and starting a business. So both of those books, I think, are timely.
I like it already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so both of those books are timely, and I love them both. The reason I paused the series is because I was looking. I was just looking around at different publishers. I was just, again, I love Brooklyn Writers Press. I love working with them. But I was just sort of kind of jumping around and seeing who else was out there. And Thomas and Mercer, who through which I'm publishing City Dark, they just, they have a lot of media presence. They have, it's a bigger platform. And they basically said, yeah, this series sounds interesting, but we're not going to pick you up in the middle of the series. Do you have something standalone? So I said, I've been thinking about a standalone. I have always been interested in the blackout. I'm a big lover of New York City. My wife and I live here now. I'm a big cheerleader of the place. I grew up in that era. I wasn't in New York during the blackout, but I've always been interested in it. So the idea of writing a standalone that combined the present day with that, that really, really terrible summer, it just sort of kind of burst out. So, here comes a standalone City Dark. Thomas and Mercer picked it up, and that's where we are. And I'm again, the book is released October 1, but so far I'm thrilled with T&M, and they're just great people, great editors. But I love Brooklyn Writers Press also, and I will go back to them to continue this series probably next year.
Do all of your characters have real people inspiration? Do you
pretty much, yeah? And
invent characters, or is there always somebody you're thinking about?
There's almost always somebody I'm thinking about. I've been lucky. I think like most of us in law, you just meet marvelous characters in this business. You could call me lazy, or you could call me, maybe if I was a better writer, I wouldn't need to lean on on these.
I don't think so. I think it's brilliant that you do that.
I
sounds just like me.
I love it. I mean, the work is done for me in so many ways. I mean, of course I tweak and I, and there are differences and there are all sorts of things that I invent. But when I have a person that I know, I almost always respect and have great affection and respect for, and then I've got this person as a template, then I run with the character from there. And I've had great success with it.
The funny thing, Roger, is that, I read City Dark after you and I spoke on my podcast, Lean to the Left, a few weeks ago. And as I read it, I'm thinking, is this Joe guy? Is this really Roger? How much of it is Roger?
It's actually not. It's actually not. I'm a drinker.
Oh, okay.
I'm a drinker for sure, but I'm a social drinker. Thankfully, I don't. I mean.
You don't black out and forget things, right?
Thank God. At least not, it's been a while. Put it that way. It's been a while. My wife keeps me on the straight and narrow. And and of course, we were all drinkers in this business. I mean, that was of course not everybody is, but but in the New York legal community and in the prosecutor community, I mean, of course that unfortunately, at the beginning of this, Mark was talking about what are the things that you do to sort of unwind, and unfortunately, that self-medicating is one of them. So I can absolutely understand a character with an alcohol problem. But yeah,
sure. Deliberate blacking out is what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But I based that character on a dear friend of mine who I work with at the Attorney General's office. He doesn't have those kinds of problems. He's not that kind of guy. But physically, I had my friend in mind, and the brilliance of that character. That character is much smarter than I am. Joe DeSantos has just an incredibly supple, just a lovely legal mind. And my friend John, who I based that character on, is very, very similar. So that's really kind of where I got him. And then the demons I just sort of added in. John's got a few of those too, but I exaggerated them, and then I just had fun with it. And I love the character. And there's a possibility I'll continue with DeSantos. I mean, if I get a warm reception to this book, who knows? I mean, anything's possible. I love this character. I think there are other stories I can tell through him. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I don't know why you wouldn't get a warm reception. It's an excellent book.
Well, hey, your lips to God's ears. We'll see. We'll know in a few weeks.
Mark, you got anything else?
Well, he's got one more book called Copperhead Road. I'm wondering what that one's
about. I mentioned that a little bit ago. That's a coming of age story. Copperhead Road, definitely not a legal thriller. It's kind of like a Stand By Me. If you remember that story, beautiful story that Stephen King told about a group of boys. The boys in Copperhead Road are a little older. It's a group of boys who are approaching their senior year in high school, and a couple of them were sexually abused as children by a local person in their community who is a leader, kind of an informal scoutmaster. So all of the dynamics around grooming and child sexual abuse are present in Copperhead Road. I started writing that story, and the story basically focuses around, this group of boys and how they support each other. There's antagonism within the group. There's a couple of boys who are victims who unfortunately sort of take out their angst and anger on another couple of boys who are victims, even though they were all victimized. So there's a lot of conflict within it. But ultimately, it's a story of hope and just love between young men, adolescents. And that is very autobiographical. I grew up with exactly that group of guys. They were able to pull me through a very, very difficult time. The sexual abuse stuff that happens in Copperhead Road is much more. It's much different, frankly, more brutal than anything I experienced. But some of those dynamics are similar, and they're there. And what I love about Copperhead Road is I think it's ahead of its time. I mean, I started writing that book in the mid-'80s when I was a teenager. I polished it once I had started as a prosecutor in my early 30s. But I think the book explores areas that really were just not talked about. And that was one of the problems I had. Actually, I had a really good agent. She's since retired, but it was unfortunate because she really believed in the book and picked it up when I first looked to put it out in 1999 or 2000, and we just couldn't get it sold. And we got a lot of nibbles from big publishers. We got a lot of interest in it, but publishers were telling me point blank, we don't know what to do with this. This isn't junior fiction. It's too brutal and it's too advanced and it's frankly too literary to qualify as a book that eighth graders would read or even high school kids. So it's a retrospective. It's an adult who's looking back at his senior year of high school, but they were just kind of like, male child sexual abuse is at the center of this book. We're really not sure how audiences are going to relate to this. So I think the timing was off in terms of commercial success at the time that I tried to get it out, which is fine. I think it succeeded artistically, and that's really what I care about. And of course, since then, I've been able to release it through a small publisher here in New York, and we'll see. If my backlist benefits from the release of City Dark, then I'll be thrilled, because as many people as can read Copperhead Road, in particular, I think, just because I think it is really important in terms of the dynamics we've been discussing today, the better.
I'll share a funny little anecdote with you. I've written Betrayal of Faith. It needs editing, and it's raw, but it's written. So I pick up a little pamphlet called How to Write and Publish Your First Novel, and the first sentence in the book is pick an entertaining topic. Don't write about things like sexual abuse. Yep. That was the first line in the book, and I'm going, whoa, I'm screwed.
Forget it, and you got to ignore it.
It's pretty funny.
You got to ignore it.
So you and I, you're like my little brother. It's like weird. I'm listening to you talk, and I'm hearing all the kinds of things I've gone through. But anyway,
that's a great honor. Let me tell you, I really appreciate that.
Don't give me that. Have you enjoyed your author career? How do you compare it to your legal career? Bob's giving us the timeout sign. So.
No, it's all right. They're both great. I mean, I loved being a lawyer. I don't practice day to day anymore. I still do training and consulting, but I haven't been in court now in several years. I do miss it, but I wouldn't go back to it. writing and teaching and consulting is what I do now, and it's just a great joy. So I've been blessed to have both sides of that career.
So you're enjoying your life.
Thank God. I have no real complaints. Small complaints, but no real.
Well, it's great. We're really grateful that you came on to the Justice Counts podcast with us today, Roger.
I'm so grateful you had me on.
Really, and I enjoyed talking to you before on the Lean to the Left podcast, which has been streaming now for a little while.
Loved it. Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, you guys, if you haven't done it already, you ought to check out Mark Bellows' Ripped from the Headlines Legal Thrillers. They're all available on Amazon and other major online booksellers. As we talked earlier, he's got quite the hero in attorney Zachary Blake, who fights for justice on all fronts. His books are Betrayal of Faith, Betrayal of Justice, Betrayal in Blue, Betrayal in Black, Betrayal High, Supreme Betrayal, Betrayal at the Border. In his latest, You Have the Right to Remain Silent. For more information, just check out markmbellow.com. Now, until next time, this is Bob Caddy from Mark Bellows signing off from Justice Counts.